That's correct. It would be 0.8, right? So to convert the fraction into a decimal, in this case, we learned two methods last week. One was using the long division, and one was using simply multiplying to get either 10 or 100. So to get 10, we'd have to multiply 5 by 2, the denominator. We'd also have to multiply 4 by 2 to give you 8. 8 over 10 would represent 0.8, the first number after the decimal point. What is 1/3 as the decimal number? We went into detail with this last week. Right, 1/3 as a decimal would be 0.333 recurring. This is a revision of last week. Moving on, what does the value 5 represent in the number? 240.65. Right, so 240.65, the second number after the decimal point is the hundredths, meaning out of 100. Let's go, guys. We still have 4 more questions. So 4 multiplied by 10 plus 6 multiplied by 1 plus 3 multiplied by 1/10 plus 2 multiplied by 1 over 100 represents what number? So we have the expanded notation and we need to write the decimal number. And the correct response would be 46.32. So the 4 is in the tens column, that would be 40. 6 is in the ones column, 6 by 1 to give you 46. Now we go to the decimal fractions where we have 3 by 1/10. That would be the first number after the decimal point, which is 3. And 2 by 100 would be the second decimal point, the second number after the decimal point, which would be 2. So we are going on to question number. So 4.56 in expanded notation is, so it's the reverse of the other question we did. Right, so in expanded notation, 4 would be in the ones column. So we have 4 by 1. 5 would be in the tenths column, meaning by 1/10. And 6 would be in the hundredths column, which would be 6 by 100. Excellent, guys. Arrange the decimal fractions into ascending order. Remember, ascending would be what? Right, so ascending means from smallest to largest. So you'd have had to put the smallest decimal fraction, which would have been 0.05, followed by 0.55, then 0.64 and 0.95. So we are on to the last question. Arrange the decimal numbers in descending order this time. So the opposite of what we just did. Right, so in this case, we need to start with the biggest number and go downwards. We start with 14.8. 14 has a tens in it, so that's the biggest one. Then we look at the other three, which would be 2.55, 1.56, and 1.48. Now, if we look at the ones column, 2 is clearly bigger than the others, 1.56 and 1.45. So far, we would have 14.8 and 2.55. Now, let's look at the two numbers with ones in them, 1.56 and 1.45. Now, which one will be bigger? Well, the both of them have 1 in the ones column. So we cannot look at that. So we go to the first number after the decimal point. We would see we have 5 in 1.56 and 4 in 1.45. But 5 is bigger than 4. So we would write 1.56 before 1.45. That is how we would get the answer. Right, so this is just a quick review of what we have talked about so far in decimal. Right, so this is just what I was today's class. Okay, guys, so we'll be picking up from the same topic of decimals. So, what are we going to do today? We are going to talk about rounding decimals to the nearest whole number and tenths. And we'll also be talking a little bit about addition and subtraction of decimals. But before we do that, let's go straight into. So let me start with the topic. Right, so we are beginning with today's topic, which will be rounding decimals nearest whole number. But before we do that, last week we spoke about converting fractions into decimals. So let's talk a little bit about converting decimals into fractions instead. Right, so we're going to do the opposite of what we did last week. Right, so last week we would have been given a fraction, for example. So let's do a quick recap. So we would have, for example, 4/5, and needed to convert this into a decimal fraction. Now this one is an easy example because we simply need to either write this in terms of 10 or 100 in the denominator, and then we can easily find our decimal fraction. So 5 by what number gives you 10? 5 by 2. So we need to multiply 4 by 2 as well to give you 3. Now 8 over 10 would be 0.8. Remember, as we talked about in the examples and the quiz, the first number after the decimal point is tenths, out of 10. So that 8 out of 10 will be indicated here. Wait, let's look at another example. Suppose we had a 1. What value would the 1 hold? Well, the 1 would be in the hundreds, so it would be out of 100 in that case. Right, so that's just a recap, a quick recap of what we talked about last week, that aspect of it. Now let's go into the other way around, which should be simple. I don't want to take it for granted. So suppose now we had this instead. Right, and I asked you, let's use a simple example, 0.5. Let's change 0.5 into common fraction. So this is the question being asked. So we have the decimals and we need to go into a fraction now. So what we need to do is as follows. We need to write this in terms of either tens or hundreds. Good job, Tash. So we need to write this in terms of tens or hundreds. Now, how will we know whether to have over 100 or over 10? What would we do? Excellent, right? So how would we identify whether to use tens or hundreds? Look at the value itself. If it's only one number after the decimal point, it means you divide over 10. If there are more than one number, for example, 5 points, divide over 100. Right? So let's go back. First step would be to write this as 5 over 10. Now, why are we writing it as 5 over 10? I would repeat. Because we simply have this one number. Right. So we have one number after the decimal point. So this is why we divide by 10. We had two numbers after the decimal point. For example, 51 would be divided by 100. That would be step 1 in the process involved. Now step 2 would be to reduce the fractions into the simplest form. What do I mean by simplest form? Well, we can simplify or reduce that fraction further. Let's take a look at it. 5 over 10. 5 can go into both 10 and 5. So if we do that, what would we get? 1 over 2. Simply because 5 can go into itself 1 time, 5 can go into 10 2 times to leave us with a half. Right? So this is an example of converting decimals into fractions. So the first thing to look at is how much points, numbers are there after the decimal points. One number, we simply divide by 10. If it's two numbers, we divide by 100. Second step would be to reduce the fraction, if you can, to a simpler form. Right? Always remember to reduce to the simplest form when you convert decimals into fractions. So before I go into an example, let me know if you're confused about this concept of converting the decimal into fractions. Brilliant, guys. Now, let us look at another example. I'm just going to clear this out now. So let's look at this example. Convert 0.16 fraction. So go ahead, guys. Take a minute. See if you can work it out and message me the answer. Convert 0.16 into a fraction. Right, so can anybody tell me what the answer would be? Good answer. It would be 4 over 25. Now let's see how we get that. Now the first thing to remember is how many numbers are there. There are two numbers after the decimal point. So would we be using hundreds or would we be using tens? So there are. So I'm writing the explanation here. So we'll use out of 100 in this case, right? So now we will write this as 16 over 100. Now this is where we have to be really careful in doing our examples. So if you're confused or lost how to go about this, look at the simplest number that can be divided by both the numerator and the denominator here. So 2 can go into 16 and you would be left with 8. 8 by 2 would give you 16. Now 1 by 2 would give you 100. 50, right? Or 100 divided by 2. Further. Can we do it again? Yes, because 2 can go into 8 to be given 4. 2 can go into 50 to be given 25. So this would be the steps involved. The main thing was identifying this. The because we have two numbers here. Because there is two numbers, it would be out of 100. Right? That's the main step involved here. So, if you guys are confused again by this example, remember we are converting decimals into fractions. So I will do one more example for you guys to make sure you all understand this, and then we proceed to another one. So just to recap, when you are converting decimals into a fraction, what you need to pay attention to is the number that is after the decimal point. What's the decimal point will be this point here after the point. Right, and will be given decimal fraction. One number after the decimal fraction will be the 1 in this case. So if the question that we did before only had that example, it would have been 1/10, and that would have been the answer. However, we have two numbers, 1/6 in this case. So because there are two numbers after the decimal point, we will divide by 100. This would give us, so the 1/6 you would literally write as 60 over 100. And then you can simplify it or break it down. So how do we break it down? Think about what number both the numerator and the denominator can be divided by. 60 can be divided by 2. 100 can also be divided by 2. This would give you 8 out of 50. Now, can that be reduced further? Yes. 8 can be divided by 2 to give you 4. 50 can be divided by 2 to give you 25. So let's look at one more example, and then we will move on. So let's try this example, 0.25. So write 0.25 as a fraction. Right, so we're converting the 0.25, which is a decimal number, into a fraction. So go ahead, guys. This one is a pretty straightforward one. You can message the answer when you get it. We'll start now. Alright, I'll give you guys about 30 seconds again, and then we'll proceed to solve it. Hey guys, so if we are writing 0.25 as a fraction, what is the first thing we look for? Well, we would look at the numbers after the decimal point. How many numbers are there after the decimal point? Well, there are two numbers after the decimal point. So because there are two numbers after the decimal point, divide by 100. What do I divide by 100? The two numbers themselves, which are after the decimal point. So that would give us 25 over 100. So these two numbers, the 2 and the 5, you would literally write that over 100, because factor position here represents hundreds out of 100. So we'll be left with 25 out of 100, but can that be simplified further? Yes, 5 can go into 25, we'll be given 5. How many times can 5 go into 10? 5 can go into 10 20 times. Can we reduce it further again? Yes, 5 can go into itself. We get 1, and 5 can go into 20, and you get 4. If giving us the answer of a quarter. So this is converting the decimals into fractions. So again, just make sure we are all on the same page. You know if we are feeling confused about this, guys. Wonderful, guys. So that would be the topic of converting fractions. Sorry, decimals into fractions. Last week we would have done the opposite, where we converted the fraction into a decimal number. So now, guys, let's go to rounding decimals to the nearest whole number and the nearest tens. That would be the other topic on the syllabus that we'll be looking at. So I will open up my whiteboard now. So let's go ahead, guys. So we're rounding decimals. Right, so we can round decimals to either the nearest tenth, or the nearest whole number. Now let's look at a previous example, how we would have rounded, let's say, whole numbers. So suppose we had the whole number 96 and needed to round this to the nearest, let's say the nearest tenth in this case. Actually, let me don't use this one. Use 86. So suppose we wanted to round the number 86 into the nearest tenth. How would we do that? Well, we would first, let's look at the column that we represent. This is the number 86. Here will be the tens column. Here will be the ones column. So what we'd have done, we would have looked at this number, which is in the ones column, so the number after the tens, because we are rounding the tens. So we'd look at the ones. If it was bigger than 5, we would have added 1 to 8. This would have given us 9, and then we would have put 0 otherwise. If, for example, the number was, let's say, 4, this is what we have done. So again, this is the tens, this is the ones column. We look at the, since we are rounding in the tens column, we look at the place after, to the right, to determine what we round by. Now, 4 is less than 5. So in this case, we'd have written back 8 and give you 0. So this would have been rounding in normal numbers we are accustomed with. Now let's look at decimals now. In the first instance, rounding decimals to whole numbers, right? So that will be the first example. So suppose we are given this number, and I ask to round to the nearest whole number. What do I do? Well, the concept is pretty much the same as you were accustomed to in the whole numbers. So what we would do now is always pay attention to what it is. This is the ones column, which we're familiar with. We have the decimal point here, right? And after the decimal point, we have the tenth, right? Or if we were to write this as a fraction, it would be 6/10, right? As we talked about before. So what would we do now? Well, the same principle would apply. So if the number is bigger than 5, what would we do? We would add 1 to the previous column. If this number was less than 5, it would remain as 1 and everything else would be 0. So 1.6 rounded to the nearest whole number would be 2, right? So why is it 2? If you're rounding decimals to the nearest whole number, always look at the first value after the decimal point. If this is bigger than 5, So 6 is bigger than 5, right? So what do we need to do? So because it's bigger than 5, you would add 1 to this column. So it will be 1 plus 1 to give you 2. Now let's look at the case where it is, let's say, 1.4. What will you do in this case? Well, it's 1.4. 4 would be less than 5. So if you were to round this to the nearest whole number, we simply have to put 1, right? Because you can't add 1 to the 1's column here, right? So this is the explanation behind rounding decimals to whole numbers. So before we go into an example, let me make sure you guys have understand. So let me know if you're confused about this concept, rounding decimals into whole numbers. Good job. So let's go into an example to make sure we understand this. To round 44.6 to the nearest whole number. A minute, guys. Let me know what you're talking about. Good job, Joshua and Kanada. About 10 seconds, guys. Try to remember, try to understand and attempt the problem, right? Okay, so how would we do this problem? Well, let's round to the nearest whole number. So what would we look at? Well, we would look at the 1's column first. So we add the 4, and then we look to the right, which is the 10's column. Right, so what would be our explanation provided? Well, since 6 is bigger than 5, right? Remember, once the value is 5 or more, you can include it. So since 6 is bigger than 5, add 1 to 1 column. Right, the 1's column would be with the right where the columns are. This would be 1. Sorry, my apologies, I wrote the wrong thing. 1's would be here. 10's would be here. 6 would represent the 10's, T-E-N-T. Right, so since the 6 is bigger than 5, we add 1 to the 1's column, where the underlined 4 is. So in this case, correct answer, 45. This is how we would round that number. Now let's try another example to make sure we understand this. Round 546.3 to the nearest whole number. So round 546.3 nearest whole number. So you can message the answer if you get it. Right, guys, so this is how we will solve this problem. So we need to round this number to the nearest whole number. So the first thing is to look at the 1's column. So the ones column would be 6, that number 6. And then we look to the right of 6, the first decimal point, which is 3. Is 3 bigger than 5 or is it less than 5? So 3 is less than 5. Therefore, the 6 in the ones column remains the same, right? Only if it was 5 or more, we could have added 1 to make it 7, but that's not the case in this time. To round in 546, nearest whole number would be equal to just 546, right? So this is rounding to the nearest whole number. Before we go into rounding into tens, the nearest tens, let's make sure we understand this. Let me know if you're feeling confused about this or not. Okay, so let's proceed to rounding into tens. So the similar concept would hold. So for example, let's say we had this number 1.45 and we need to round to now round to the nearest tenth is not the same as saying round to the nearest tens, right? The tens column would be here before the decimal. So the tens column would be the first number after the decimal point. So this would be the number we're looking at before. So when we are doing rounding, we also consider the value we are rounding to. So this would be the tens column. And then we look at the number to the right. So this would represent the hundreds. So if that number is 5 or more, we add 1 to the previous column. So what do I mean by that? So step 1 is we look at the number we are considering, which would be the tens. We look to the number to the right of that. If this number is 5 or more, we add 1 to this number before it, which we're looking at. So in this case, is it 5 or more? Yes, it is 5 or more. Therefore, we are rounding to the nearest tenth. This is what we would get. 1/4 would go to 5 because we need to add 1 since it's 5, and we would get 1.5. So that is how we round to the nearest tenth. Do not to be confused with rounding to the nearest tens, right? This is decimal, rounding decimal. So before we do an example, we have nearly run out of time, but let's do one example. Before we do an example, let me know if you're confused about the idea of rounding to the nearest 10. Okay, guys. So we have time to do, went a little over time, but we got a little bit late. So let's round 4.5 to the nearest 10. Take a minute, guys. Let me know if you can move this one out. Good job, Joshua and Sajida. So how do we do this? Look at the decimal point in 10, which would be 5 we are considering, and then the number to the right of it, which is 6. Is 6 bigger than 5? Is it 5 or more? Yes. What do we need to do? To add 1 to the 5 would give us 4.2. Guys, with that, we have come to the end of this tutorial. It was a pleasure visiting you. Please take a minute to fill out the quality control questions that would appear at the end of this meeting. Let us know what you'd like us to do differently and how we can improve the better grades. Thank you for choosing BetterGradesFast.com to have a blessed day. Guys, we would have the grades past paper sessions right after this class. Have this class, you can join back. If not, we'll be here until next Tuesday where we continue with this